There was a copper kettle on the wash-house stove, already steaming though the sun was barely over the fields, and I was bent over the wash bench with my hands in the rinse water when the first gripping took me, low and sure, like a hand closing slow around my middle. I was 21 years old, 2 years married, and it was a Monday in the March of that year, wash day, the snow melting off the porch eave in slow drops onto the stones. I straightened and I breathed, and I waited for it to pass the way the older wives had told me the early ones pass. And when it passed, I sent the boy from the next farm running across the fields for the midwife, because in our district a wife does not choose anything about the day her baby comes. Not the room, not the window, not the name of the doctor in town. I did not know yet how much of that day had already been decided for me, nor by whom, nor what the one question was that nobody under my own roof was going to ask me. In our district, a birth is arranged long before it begins, the way a wedding is, the way a funeral is, and none of the arranging is done by the woman it is arranged for. The midwife is settled by the bishop's wife and her circle, quiet women who keep the unwritten list of whose hands are steady and whose prayers are long, and my husband was told the customs by his father the winter I began to show, what would be brought, what would be paid, what would be said, and my own mother was told her place, which was the door of my room and no farther in. I was told nothing, and I want to be honest that I did not think to want to be told, because I had finished my schooling at the 8th grade like every child I knew, and what I knew of babies was what a girl learns from washing diapers at a cousin's house, and from the things married women stop saying when an unmarried one walks up to the wash line. The ordnung is not written anywhere, not on any paper I ever saw, but it sits in a house the way the smell of the canning cellar sits in the stairs, and one of the things it said in our district was that a first labor is a thing that happens to a wife, not a thing she has any part in planning. That was the first thing I gave up, though I could not have named it then. I gave up the plan itself, the idea that there was anything to plan, and I folded it into being a wife the way I folded the wash, without once being asked whether I minded the folding. I did not have a word for it yet. All that winter the preparations went on around me the way weather goes on around a house, and I was the house. Aaron's mother bleached the lying-in sheet herself, an old soft linen sheet that had caught 2 generations of babies in his family, and she folded it into my cedar chest without a word to me about it, and I understood the sheet had been decided the way everything else had been decided. The naming talk happened in the room next to mine, his mother and his aunts over their quilting, names from his side weighed like goods, and when I said one evening at the table that I had always been fond of the name Lydia, the room went gently quiet, and Aaron said we would see what the baby was before we spoke of names, and that was the end of it. Every question I raised that winter got the same soft answer. When I asked my mother how long the labor would take, she said the midwife will know. When I asked whether I would labor in our bed or in the small room downstairs, she said the midwife will know. When I asked what would happen if something went wrong, if there was a doctor in town whose name could be said aloud, she looked at me the way you look at a child who has asked why the sky holds itself up, and she said, "We do not carry insurance, daughter. We carry each other, and the midwife will know." At the wash line, the other wives traded their birth stories, but they traded them as warnings and not as knowledge, half sentences that ended when I came near, and I learned to read their faces the way you read a sky, and what I read was that every one of them had been through a day nobody had prepared her for, and every one of them had decided that silence was the kindest thing she could hand down. I did not have a word for it yet, but I was beginning to feel the shape of the word, the way you feel a tooth with your tongue before it aches. Miriam came in the early afternoon, in her black buggy with her bag, a kind woman with red hands who had caught half the babies in our district, and from the moment her boots crossed my door, the day reorganized itself around her the way furniture is moved for a preacher on Jime Sunday. Aaron was sent to the barn and then to the far field, because men are not to be underfoot, and he went with his hat in his hands and a look at me that I could not read then and have never forgotten since. His mother took over my kitchen as if it had always been hers, the kettle and the rags and the warmed stones, and my mother took her place at the door of my room, and Miriam set me walking, up and down the lane of the house, from the stove to the window and back, because walking is the custom, walking brings the baby, and I walked, and the gripping came and went, and the afternoon light moved across the floorboards I had scrubbed on my knees the week before. I remember doing arithmetic in my head between the walkings, counting the decisions that had already been made since breakfast, the room, the walking, the window shut against the March air, the men sent away, and every one of them made by someone kind, and not one of them made by me. And here I will stop a moment, because if you have sat with me this far into my story, if you have ever been walked through a day of your own life like a guest in it, I would be glad if you would subscribe to this channel, so you do not miss what old Lisbeth asked me when it was all over, and gladder still to read in the comments whether anyone ever asked you what you wanted on the hardest day of your life. I read everyone. Toward evening the labor grew long, the way a field grows long at the end of a plowing day, and it was then that I began to ask for things, which a wife in our district does not do often, and never in labor, because labor is the one day she is meant to be brave and quiet. I asked for the window to be opened a crack, because the room was close and the lamp smoke was thick, and Miriam said gently that March air is no friend to a laboring mother, and the window stayed shut, and that was the custom. I asked whether I might lie flat a while, because my legs were trembling from the walking, and his mother said the walking was what brought the baby safe, and I was helped up from the bed's edge, and that was the custom too. And then, in the low part of the evening, when the gripping was coming close and hard and I was frightened in a way I had never been frightened, I asked the question I had been carrying all winter, the one my mother had turned aside at the wash line. I asked whether there was a doctor in town, whether someone knew his name, whether the boy could be sent for him if the night went badly. The room went still. My mother looked at the floor. Aaron's mother looked at the kettle, and Miriam looked at the door, not at me, at the door, and I understood all at once that the doctor's name was not Miriam's to say, and not mine to ask for, that if the night went badly, it would be the men in the barn who decided whether a buggy went for town, men who had never labored and never would, deciding about a body that was mine. And here is the thing I have carried longest from that day. As Miriam turned back from the door to me, there was a question on her face, plain as writing, a question she had been taught somewhere and had somewhere unlearned. I watched it rise in her, and I watched it die in her, and she put her cool red hand on my forehead and said only, "Be brave now, my Dell. Be brave." The question never left her mouth. I did not have a word for it yet, but I knew I had seen something withheld from me, and I did not know yet that it had been withheld from her first. My daughter was born safe in the lamplight, a little before midnight, and that is all I will say of the hour itself, because some hours belong to God and to the women who were in them, and this one ended well, and I thanked God for it on my knees the next morning. It was weeks later, at her first church Sunday, the first Jime she was carried to, that old Lisbeth took my hands. Lisbeth was the midwife before Miriam, the one who had caught half the district before Miriam caught the other half, who had caught my own husband Aaron out of his first wife's sister's arms 20-some years before, an old straight woman with a face like a winter apple, retired now and sitting on the bench with the grandmothers. She took my hands in her two dry ones, and she looked at me a long moment, and she said, "Maydell, would you have wanted the doctor?" I did not understand her at first. I said the baby came safe, Lisbeth, and God was good. And she said, "That is not what I asked you, child. I asked whether you would have wanted him, the doctor, if anyone had thought to ask you." And then she told me a thing I have never once repeated in my district until tonight. She said that in her years, in the years when she learned the catching of babies from the old woman who taught her, the question belonged to the mother. A midwife was taught to sit by the laboring woman in the early hours and ask her, plain and private, "Do you want the doctor if it comes to it?" and to carry that answer like a lantern through the whole night, and to ask the men nothing until the mother had answered. And she said that somewhere between her years and Miriam's years, with no vote ever taken and no line ever written in any ordnung, the asking moved. It moved from the mother to the house around her, to the husbands in the barn and the mothers at the door, until at last the question was not asked at all, because everyone in the room already knew what the room would answer. She said Miriam was a good woman and a careful one, and she had been taught the new way, and the new way had no question in it. I stood there with my daughter asleep against my shoulder, and I understood my whole Labor Day for the first time. It had not been cruel, it had not been God, and it had not been the church, and it had not even been Miriam. It had been an arrangement, an old arrangement that had drifted, the way a fence line drifts a little every winter until one spring the field it holds is a different field. Nobody had taken the question from me with any ill will. It had simply been handed from hand to hand until no hand was holding it, and I was the one left laboring inside the silence where it used to be. Nothing loud changed after that Sunday, and I want to be honest about that, because the loud changes make the good stories and the small ones make the true ones. Miriam still attends the births in our district, and she is still kind, and I still take her a jar of my peaches every autumn when the canning is done, and I mean it when I give it. But some small things are different now, and they began with me. When a cousin of mine on my mother's side, newly married and carrying her first, came to me last winter with her eyes full of the same questions I once carried, I did not hand her the silence I was handed. I sat down beside her at my own table, not in the doorway, and I told her the question to learn by heart, and to ask early, and out loud, before the day ever comes. Would I want the doctor? Let us answer it now, I told her, while the answering is easy, so the question is never missing when it matters. And in my own house I have begun a small habit that Aaron has never remarked on and never once resisted. When a thing is asked of me now, I answer with a question first. If I am asked whether the visiting can be Sunday, I ask what day would rest me best. If I am asked whether the second cutting can wait, I ask whose back the waiting costs. They are small questions, and no one in my house finds them strange, and that is the strange thing, how quickly a house can learn a new custom when the custom is only fairness. Aaron himself, who was sent to the barn that March day like every husband before him, came in that night after the baby slept, and he sat by my bed and did not speak, and I have never asked him what the men said in the barn, and he has never asked me what I felt in the room. But the next spring, when my neighbor Mary labored, it was Aaron who hitched the buggy without being told, and drove it to the end of the lane, and waited there an hour in the cold, ready, in case anyone should ask for the doctor. No one did. But the buggy stood ready, and I count that the beginning of the asking coming back. I am telling you this not because the hands that attended me were cruel hands, because they were not. Miriam's hands were kind, and my mother's were, and my husband's mother's were, and I believe with my whole heart that every woman in that room was doing exactly what she had been taught a good woman does. And if this confession names a real harm, and it does, then it names it with love, because no harm I have told you tonight was ever meant as one by the people in it. That is what I most want you to hear, especially if you are a wife, especially if you are a mother, especially if you have ever been brave and quiet on a day that belonged to you. The customs that surround a laboring woman were built by hands that meant her well, and still a mother is allowed a voice in her own labor. Still she is allowed to be asked. Still the question belongs to her, even when no one remembers to hand it to her, and it is no sin against anyone to take it back up and ask it herself, early, out loud, while the answering is easy. I spent a long winter and a long day believing that silence was the kindest thing a wife could hand down, and I do not believe it anymore. The kindest thing we can hand down is the question. Ask it for your daughters, and ask it for your sons to carry, and if no one ever asked it for you, ask it now, in your own heart, and let the answering be yours. For years I walked through that March day inside a silence I had no name for. I did not have a word for it yet, and now I do. The word is mine, and the asking is mine, and I have a word for it now. Thank you for sitting with me through this one. It was not an easy day to carry back up out of memory, but it was mine, and it needed telling. I wrote it all down in my book, the parts I could say out loud and the parts I could only write, the whole story of that march and what came after. The full story is in the first pinned comment, and there is a link in the description if it should ever be a comfort to you. Until next time, ask your questions early and out loud.